Welcome, everybody. Today's topic is what should Americans do about gun violence? And I have with me Nikhil Kalathil from Stanford University at the Hoover Institution. Oh, hey, Nikhil.
Hi there, Ben. How you doing?
Doing well. How are you doing?
Pretty well.
Um, my name's Ben Peterson. I just graduated from the Pepperdine University School of Public Policy. I'm about to start a PhD at Texas A&M in political science. I don't represent either of those institutions. These opinions are just my own.
The same is true for me. I don't represent Stanford or the Hoover Institution. These opinions are just my own.
Cool. So to give our viewers some context, I'm not sure exactly when this is going to be posted, but we're talking about a week and a half after the massacre in Orlando, the largest or the deadliest, terrorist attacks since 9/11 on U.S. soil. Also, the deadliest mass shooting, I believe, since 1948. Gunmen targeted a nightclub called The Pulse, which caters to an LGBT clientele, declared allegiance, I think, on a call to the police to ISIS, and had been previously investigated by, I believe, the FBI in connection to some kind of terrorist watch list. So that's kind of the context. Just Monday of this week, a couple days ago, the Senate voted down 4 different measures, and we might mention those later on. 4 different measures aimed at specifically at preventing suspected terrorists from purchasing guns, and also expanding the background check system, improving and expanding the background check system. Those are all voted down. We can get into that later if we need to. But we're going to take the issue, I think, a little bit more broadly. This is going to be a conversation for a long time. And the way I've written a couple things about this, and the way I'll kind of start here, the way I think that we should think about gun violence, particularly mass gun violence, a lot of the high-profile mass shootings that we've seen in recent years, is to ask the question, why are they happening more now? They are happening more now since sort of the late 90s. Columbine was the first big one in 1999 in recent history. And my question is why? Why are people more likely to do this now? And so I tend to point to, well, there's a few things, particularly in Orlando. I think that's connected to a pattern of ISIS-inspired attacks, San Bernardino, Paris, Brussels. So I think that's the key there, but so that's the motive in several of those instances. Secondly, there's a motive, or there's a sort of underlying cause of mental illness in a lot of cases that we've seen. I think Adam Lanza in Newtown is a good example of that. There's been several instances like that. There's also a third that I think you brought to my attention, Nikhil, with some of the articles you sent, which is sort of like what some have described as right-wing or sort of other white supremacists, with Dylan Roof in South Carolina. There's other examples of politically motivated, which I would describe as terrorism of a different sort than ISIS-inspired or inspired by radical Islam of some sort. So there's, but my question, my broader point is that when we deal with these things, it's often framed as, well, we need to take action immediately, and we need to pass, gun control measures. I think we can debate specific gun control measures, and we should, but I don't think there's a panacea pill for how to stop those kind of things. I think it's indicative of a broader cultural failings of people. There's a lot of people who struggling to find a sense of purpose, struggling to find a sense of meaning in life, and in severe cases, that sometimes leads people to hatred for other people, even that extends to their own life, willingness to die themselves in a lot of these cases. And so that's kind of my general approach, that I don't think we're going to stop this by, I don't think we're going to stop it easily simply by increasing regulations. But I think you have a different take, Nikhil, so I'll kind of turn it over to you to give a statement.
Yeah, first, thanks so much. Obviously, our condolences go out to all the victims of the Pulse shooting. It's absolutely horrible. But basically, my question is, I totally agree with you that this issue is about certain cultural failings and is about much deeper issues than just gun control or gun violence. But those issues about mental health, about people struggling, about people not having a place in the world, those are not uniquely American issues, or at least I don't think that they're uniquely American issues. And yet, America seems to be the only country, or the only advanced country, that has these types of mass shootings on a regular basis. The American gun problem and the problem with gun violence seems to be unique, and other countries seem to have addressed this issue pretty well. And so either the issue is that there's something inherently wrong with the American people, and that there's something wrong with American culture that is causing these violences and causing this stuff, which kind of goes against, decades of American exceptionalism. Basically, I don't believe that there's something inherently wrong with the American people at all. And so if it's not the American people that are wrong, it seems like the only other alternative is that the American political system is not addressing these issues in the correct way through policy and regulations. Whereas other countries, other advanced countries, Australia comes to mind, for example, and Japan, for example, as well, who have passed more strict gun control measures, have had a greater success about dealing with these issues, about mitigating mass shootings, and about mitigating gun violence. And so I absolutely agree with you that we need to address the underlying problems, but before we can address the underlying problems, I think that we need to stop having people die. And once people aren't dying anymore, then you can start going out and doing, community outreach or improving mental health institutions, because all of those problems that you addressed are not problems that are going to be easy fixes at all. And that's not saying that gun control is an easy fix either, but I think that there are certain policies and legislation that can be passed that can directly address this issue of gun death and gun violence. And I think that this sort of issue speaks to a broader trend in policy making in general, which is that policy making should be experimental. We shouldn't expect a policy to just come into play and immediately fix everything. There's going to be problems that policy creates, and that policy is going to need to be amended. And yet we seem to, as a legislative body, as Americans, seem to immediately dub a policy a failure if it has even one wrong element to it, rather than working towards building on top of that policy and improving it to move forward. And in this case, I think this is a perfect representation of how there really is, I totally agree with you, there's no sort of one-size-fits-all solution to this problem, and it's going to be kind of adaptable, and it's going to change as we move forward. But there are a few concrete things that we can do. First, funding gun research, so banning getting rid of the Dickey Amendment. And then second, doing basic things like background checks and stuff like that. And so that's sort of where I'm coming from.
Okay, yeah. Actually, at the Dickey Amendment, I'd like to know a little bit more about that, because that's not something I would totally oppose, in terms of funding gun. But what that would do would be the Center for Disease Control and Prevention would do that, right? So right. That leads into a little bit of, I guess I take a little bit of issue with the idea that this is a public health issue, because again, I want to emphasize that the deep problem, the kind of scary problem that's hard to address, is that there's intent here. There's people who are acting out what I would call evil intent, and so I think that's going to be that's the tricky thing here. And so what's going on, that there's people who become so emotionally disturbed or driven by a political agenda, or I would argue spiritually as well, spiritually unfulfilled, that they would want to kill people and also kill themselves. And so anyway, but I want to
ask you just as a starting question, why do you think that those people are only, like, this problem is only appearing in America? Or I guess, obviously the Paris and Brussels attack are different, but so I think maybe it would be helpful to divide it into two broad camps, which is sort of the more, I guess, internationally motivated terror attacks, which I would say Orlando kind of straddles that divide. I'm not completely convinced that it's an ISIS-motivated shooting as much as it is sort of a more mental health related shooting. There's these reports that the individual in question may or may not have been gay, may or not have been struggling with these kind of issues himself, rejection from his wife, from his father, so on and so forth. We made him a very disturbed person and kind of compelled him to do the things that he did. And then the other sort of shootings, the Columbines, the Sandy Hook, et cetera, those are sort of, I guess, more along the mental side of that spectrum. And there's obviously some blurred lines between the two. But would you say that the latter of those two would fall under a public health sort of issue, or is that still not a public health issue?
in the mental health, attachment there, or the element there. Yeah, I mean, I can see that in particular. Although a lot of yeah. So in terms of mental health, yeah, I think there's work we can do there that would fall into the public health rubric.
And then, I guess, sorry, the real question I did want you to answer was why is it that this seems to be an American problem?
Yeah, I'm going there. So so that's, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's not true that mass shootings don't happen in other countries. Not as common. I agree that we have a problem that's sort of a uniquely American problem. But I would describe that problem in the context of, and this is what I try to point out in the article that I wrote last year for Intercollegiate Review. America has a long tradition of gun ownership. And so, yeah, the Vox article that you provided, that you sent over, that I think we'll post, we have a very high level of gun ownership in this country. There's lots of guns in the country, almost one for every person, right? And obviously it's becoming more concentrated. Gun ownership is actually declining, although it's becoming more concentrated. So I think we have to understand we have a long history and tradition of gun ownership. And that in the past, that has not resulted in, in the kinds of episodes of mass gun violence that we're seeing.
Well, that's not completely true.
To the degree, there at 66 here in Austin, there was a mass shooting, but they were much rarer. I mean, and there were the most deadly. I think 6 of the 10, or now 7 or maybe 8 of the most deadliest have occurred, since 1999. So that they seem to be increasing in frequency and in death toll. So the question is, it still comes back to me, the question of, okay, why has that culture that previously supported a high level of gun ownership, which was probably even more common, more widespread in the past than it is today, why has that broken down? So yeah, in a sense, yeah, I think you're right. America has a unique problem on its hands because of our history of and tradition of gun ownership. And then the second, so there's one point. The other point that I think we both mentioned in conversation before this is that there's 2 separate things, right? There's the high-profile mass shooting incidents like Orlando and others that have potentially some connection to international events and things, like in this case at least. I would say it's pretty clear, that he was motivated by, and he may have also had the issues that you described, but I mean, I think he was pretty clear about his motivation. I've seen reports that he studied at a seminary where there was a gentleman who was connected with the blind sheikh who was responsible for the World Trade Center bombing in the early 90s. So I mean, I think that inspiration is pretty clear, if perhaps related to other issues as well. But the other issue is that when we're talking about gun violence, in the country, overall it's declined. Overall, since 1993, the peak in 1993, gun violence has declined. Maybe an uptick this year. However, suicides and I think gang violence are the drivers now overall in terms of when we're talking about gun violence. Those are the key things we should talk about. And so later on, if you want to bring up some specific, you had some questions here about what do people who are kind of against broad strokes, like me, who are against broad strokes gun control, what do we propose? And I have some ideas about how to do that.
Yeah, I would love to hear that. And just really quickly, I do want to clarify, I'm not diminishing the ISIS connections the Orlando shooter may or may not have. I obviously think that definitely played a huge element in motivating him to do this. But I don't think that this is quite as clear-cut of a case as the San Bernardino, Paris, or Brussels ones, which really do seem very, anti-West motivated, or like Islamist motivated, whereas this one is more nuanced, is I guess the only argument that I would make there. And I think that you brought up an interesting point in that article that you wrote about what is gun culture. And, gun culture should be this kind of respect towards a gun, should be an attitude about how you treat a gun, how you view a gun, et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely.
And so I would wonder, do you think that some of this, some of the change in recent years and stuff like that is is because of a failure to build that sort of a gun culture, and comes from, maybe some push towards just Second Amendment rights blatantly without acknowledging the need for a positive gun culture?
That's a great question, and yeah, I could concede that, to a degree. I'm not I'm not an NRA member. I don't quite see them. I think the rush to implicate NRA in mass shootings is not appropriate. In other words, I think the NRA, I think they feel they are capitalizing on the feeling that a lot of people have, in some cases maybe inflaming. And I wrote about this in the New York Times, that in other words, they benefit from a sense of fear that people are coming to take your guns or something like that, right? But so I'm not ready to quite I don't want to demonize them. I think it's a single.
No, absolutely. I agree with you. I don't want to demonize them either, but I do think that, at least in most of the discussions that I've heard about this issue, it's either, gun control, take away your guns, or free guns for everyone. And there's no this sort of, your article was honestly the first article that I've read that brings up this issue of non-legislative ways to enact gun control, which is, sort of that cultural gun control idea.
Yeah. And so let me add to that. Part of what I suggest in the article, and this is probably, I do think a lot of conservatives or Second Amendment promoters types don't realize what you're saying, that we do have a fairly unique problem, that we're seeing that more. I think we need to deal with it, and I do definitely want to propose certain cultural factors that we could do. It's cultural, in other words, person to person. I think it's a lot about other sort of favorite conservative issues,
But do you think that legislation should play a role in helping those cultural issues take root?
Here's where I'm not clear what exact legislation would have that kind of effect, and we can talk about specifics if you want.
I think this would be a good time to transition into some of those questions of what does someone like you think the solution to this problem is?
That's a great question. So first of all, like I said at the beginning, I don't think there's a quick so broadly the answer, I don't think there's a quick legislative fix. For instance,
and we both agree about that.
What's that?
We both agree on that point.
Yeah. Or even a long, so there's the question. But what I do think is, so let's take, for instance, there's one program that is piloted by David Kennedy, who's a criminologist, called Ceasefire. And this is not necessarily about the mass shootings that we've been seeing.
Sure.
But this is more about inner city, urban violence, often gang related. And his insight was that, and a lot of it started in Boston, I think, Ceasefire Initiative.
Is this to pay people to not do crimes stuff?
No, it's more like what it is. It's almost like a community-wide intervention. Okay. And so you identify the people who are, a lot of times it's a very small number of people driving, who are involved in this kind of violent crime, particularly murders, gun violence, things like that. And you identify them, you call them in essentially to and you have kind of a community-wide intervention. And the details are very easy to find. I'll even post something. We can post something in on this. I think that is a measure that, and there's a New Republic article actually that I think it was after Newtown in 2012 that a lot of people pushed for this, but it did not get any funding. It didn't get any additional federal funding. So I think that was a loss. I think that was something that should have had more, should have gotten more attention. And is the challenge again is often we're talking about these high-profile mass shooting incidents.
Yeah, and I think that what you bring up is those are really, really amazing programs, and I think that does a much better job of addressing the underlying issues. But as you sort of mentioned, we have this kind of trend of disturbed individuals or people with questionable backgrounds having access to these pretty powerful weapons of war that they can then use to commit some pretty heinous acts. And so why should they have such easy access to those weapons? Why shouldn't that process be more stringent. And it's not like we don't have any sort of gun control measures. I mean, after the 1930s, we outlawed machine guns.
Right.
And that like had pretty good effect. You know, we don't have huge machine gun massacres anymore, which was like a pretty big thing back then. And so why is this issue different than that?
Yeah, that's a great question, because and this kind of brings us to some of the questions, and I may turn it over back to you again for a second here, because it kind of relates to the broader discussion on the Second Amendment.
Yeah.
What does the Second Amendment mean? Why does it matter? And so here's my view, and then I'll turn it over to you here in a second. My view is that the only thing that would really have effect, certainly in terms of mass shootings and even in other settings, since guns are so ubiquitous in our tradition, in our culture, in our history, and since they're so currently readily available, the only thing that would seriously, you brought up Australia, I think that actually, you know, in other words, it would be a shift from a culture where the expectation is that unless you have a criminal record, unless you have a serious mental illness, unless you have you know, proven ties to terrorism or something like that, you can get a gun. That's the current sort of assumption, right? Yeah. That I would say is sort of protected under the Second Amendment, and certainly protected under the current interpretation. So the only thing that I think that would, from a legislative perspective, that would really seriously curtail these kind of, or limit these heinous attacks, legislative. Again, I'm in favor of some certain cultural things and stuff we need to do. That would be like an Australia type program.
Like a buyback program?
Yeah, like a major buyback program, and also, you know, coupled with the assault weapons ban, coupled with even more strict, even potentially even, in other words, and I think those would
You'd be in favor of something like that, though.
No, see, that's where I think probably the rubber meets the road between me and you, or
okay.
You know, because I think that the inherent conundrum is that, and I wrote about this in one of the other articles I wrote. The inherent conundrum is that we don't know. A lot of times, the people who are doing these things are passing background checks. Sometimes they shouldn't, and that's a problem I think we should address. And so I would,
the Orlando guy, for example.
Yeah, you know, he's been investigated. And so I favor improvements to that, to the background checks and to sharing information and all those. I would have favored some of the legislation in the Senate. I think some Republicans actually proposed. But the problem is, a lot of times these people don't have any kind of history like that. Mm-hmm. And so the problem is we don't know. And so, and I do think, and here's where the rubber meets the road, I think the Second Amendment is an important liberty. It is a danger. I'll admit it's a very dangerous liberty. It's a unique liberty that you point out at the beginning. It's a unique American liberty. It can be terribly abused, and in many cases it is being abused. So I guess I suppose that in order to go the Australia route, I think that would constitute a change in, we would be sacrificing, I think, an important liberty.
So how is something like the machine guns ban not sacrificing that liberty, but something like an assault weapons ban is?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, in other words, as a lot of people brought up, and I totally agree, no right is unlimited. Mm-hmm. Even the right of free speech, even there are certain restrictions on the right of religious liberty and all these things. I mean, and often the debate is, where is that line? Yeah. And I think that, yeah, the machine gun is something that, by the way, you can still get it if you have to go through a certain process, like you have to pay a fee and you have to register and things like that. So the question is, should we further
push that line out, I guess?
Yeah, and I would argue that the assault weapon, what is considered assault weapons, semi-automatic rifles, those are owned by millions of millions of Americans. Many millions of Americans buy them, and so again, I think it's I think it is too broad of a brush, too broad of a curtailment on a liberty that many Americans exercise completely legally, and the people, you know, so they will, it will not, and I don't think they will stop the mass shootings. A lot of them have.
I agree that it probably wouldn't stop the mass shootings, but it might decrease them somewhat, which is sort of, you know, I would be okay with that. And so this might be a good time, because I think we're kind of running out of time a little bit, to move on to just briefly talking about the Second Amendment in general. which is something that you brought up that I've had questions about, which is I find it kind of ironic that a lot of conservative scholars tend to kind of have originalist views of the Constitution and interpretations of the Constitution. And I wonder, how does that originalist view relate to the Second Amendment? Because is it really reasonable to expect that the Founding Fathers would have wanted to protect everyone's individual right to an assault weapon? Or can you even have that question, considering how far technology has advanced from today about this issue? Because if the Founding Fathers wrote this in the context of a newly formed America, who they believed that people needed to defend themselves from Britain, from other things like that, and the weapons that they had access to were not nearly as lethal as the weapons that we have access to right now. And so, I just have a question about why is it that we view any sort of gun control as an encroachment on the Second Amendment when it seems like that distinction, you mentioned how no right is unlimited, but it seems like we take the Second Amendment to be the least limited of those rights.
So yeah, that's really, I do think that's an interesting question, and it's the Second Amendment, the wording is notoriously somewhat ambiguous,
yeah,
or at least disputed. I think it pretty clearly, it says the right of the people to keep and bear arms will not be infringed.
Sure.
So it is directed, I think.
Arms is also not guns necessarily.
I think I've read some that it pretty clearly it was referring to guns that would be used to form a militia, right? So
Right.
it is connected with the militia, and this is, I think, is an interesting point that. And the way I would describe it, what I think is going on, and I'm not a legal scholar, but I've read some people. I've especially followed Charles C.W. Cook, who's a writer at National Review. I think he makes a pretty good case for the importance of the Second Amendment and all these things. But what's going on, I think, my sense is that it says, yeah, so since militia is really important to public order, to the maintenance of public order, people, the right of the people to keep and bear arms. Again, like you said, it's not referring to what we would describe as a assault weapon or a semi-automatic rifle, but it is referring to a standard military weapon at the time, I think, which is what people would use in war. So
just really quickly, if I can intercede, I think that what's really interesting is that the relation to the militia almost connects back to this idea about gun culture, where, if you're part of this militia, you're part of this culture of, we know how these guns work, we know how these guns are used and stuff like that. So just as a hypothetical, I'm kind of just curious about your point here. Would you be in favor of, if you want to buy a gun, you have to go through a 5-day training course, get a certificate, which, educates you about history of guns, about, proper gun maintenance, proper gun safety, all these things, kind of like a driver's test or a driver's ed sort of thing.
Yeah.
And then you go get your gun. Is that something that would be too much, or is that something that you think would be reasonable?
I wouldn't be opposed to that. Certainly, if it was enacted at the state level, and this is another point I want to make. I think that, so for instance, it's kind of been missed in the public conversation, but California and Connecticut and some other states have assault weapons bans, kind of like a lot of people have proposed at the federal level. And I think that should be. I think states should have some latitude to infringe a little more, I suppose. And this is where I actually part company with a lot of, I suppose, like gun rights enthusiasts, but I'm a big proponent of federalism, which means that I think states ought to have some latitude to in other words, control, as long as the court has ruled, as long as it's not sort of a blanket, you can't get a gun at all, provided you with some other exceptions, criminal background and all this stuff. So I actually think, let's say, I doubt it would happen, but if a state wanted to implement something like that, I think that would be, I think that would be a good practice in general. That's kind of what happens for concealed carry permits, at least in Texas. It's not a 5-day, but it's, you have to go take a class. It's still not foolproof. Someone could easily do that with ill intent. but I actually, in the sense that it encourages sort of like a gun culture rightly understood, that you know, appreciate your kind of taking a read of that, because I do think there's something valuable to that, and I would even, yeah, I certainly at the state level, I would want to think about that before requiring that at the federal level, though.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to get your perspective on that, because I know a lot of, I've talked to some people about this who really push back against that idea of a driver's ed kind of equivalent. You know, like basically in my mind, it seems like a no-brainer that the process to get and own a gun should at least be as rigorous as the process to get and own a car. But, you know, that's my perspective on the issue.
So let me ask you, what of any of the particular, just, we got a few minutes here, but of any of the particular proposals, what are there any, you indicated to me that you weren't really very happy with any of them, but there's been the big one, that there's a compromise bill that I think is in the works right now by Senator Collins. I think she's of Maine, not sure. Is a no, sort of some version of a no-buy list, which is, in other words, if you're too dangerous to fly on a plane because you're on some kind of terrorist watch list, then you're too dangerous to buy a gun. Yeah. The counter argument has been, well, those lists are pretty are not exactly,
they're pretty sketchy.
Yeah, they're super sketch, and so someone can just get, you know, might get a constitutional right taken away from them just because their name actually ends up on a random list. I mean, what's any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think that the issue about due process and the no-buy list is a really, really interesting and nuanced issue. I think to some extent, you know, part of me wants to say, you know, we really just need to stop letting people die, and then we can worry about amending these issues to worry about the due process kind of stuff later down the line. And this goes back to that initial point that I had, which is that policy should be experimental. You know, we put this policy out because we need to stop this problem that's happening right now. And then as we realize that there are problems with that policy, or there are better ways to go about doing things, you kind of change that policy, and has a living sort of element to it, I guess. I think that the compromise between the Republicans and Democrats, I don't remember the name of the bill, is a really good compromise. I think that having a judge require that there be probable cause to deny the sale is a really good kind of check on the, what's it called? The unfettered ability of the FBI or federal government to just say, hey, you're on this watch list, you can't buy a gun anymore.
Right. Yeah,
I definitely think that we need to expand background checks. I think it's ridiculous that there are no background checks for online sales and gun shows. I don't see why is that okay at all.
Yeah, that's one I'd want to think about. I'm not in favor of that expansion. I'm not sure it would be workable. In other words, because let's say if you want to give a gun to a family member or something like that, or a friend, you know, I mean, I don't see any way to do that without basically a gun registry that, you know, I haven't thought deeply into this, but
I think a better solution in this case is again sort of more of that education type program, that driver's ed sort of comparison, where, you know, in same, you know, you wouldn't just hand your car down to your kid. Your kid has to go get a permit, learn how to use the car, get a license, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that the process should be pretty similar for guns. You know, cars can kill people, but they're primarily used for transportation. Guns can kill people. You know, most people,
I think.
Pardon?
I think more people die in car accidents than in recent years
or at least they used to. But again, this is an issue, you know, where people were dying in car accidents, and so they put seatbelts in cars and mandated that seatbelts and airbags be a thing. Where it's a direct example of how people are dying. There's a policy answer to solve this problem, and I think that this situation is pretty similar. And we need to get to a point where we can talk about how we can design good policy, because I think all the concerns that you brought up are really, really legitimate and excellent concerns. And I really like this idea of, you know, community-based outreach programs and non-legislative approaches to gun control. But those kind of programs could have fruit in legislative programs as well. And we need to get to the point where we can talk as Republicans and Democrats, as liberals and conservatives, progressives and whatever, that just because I want to limit your gun ownership rights or kind of monitor them doesn't mean I want to take them away, or doesn't mean that I want to infringe upon your freedom and your right to bear these arms. I just want to make sure that we're all doing it in a responsible fashion.
All right, I'll leave you with the last word there. So thanks everyone for listening. Feel free to email us if there's if there's topics you want us to explore, that if you want to participate, anything like that. Hope you enjoy, and hopefully this conversation will continue. It's going to continue to be a difficult but important conversation for American citizens to have. So, Nikhil, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Ben.
All right, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Talk to you later.